everyone. Welcome to a special video episode of the Authority File podcast brought to you by Choice and the OECD, also known as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Many of you are watching this right now and attending ALA Annual, so I trust you're enjoying the conference so far. My name is Bill Mickey. I'm the editorial director at Choice. We're a publishing division of the Association of College and Research Libraries. I'm joined today by Will Davis, who is head of the OECD's Washington Center, where he serves as the organization's senior representative to the United States and Canada. Welcome, Will. And
Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome. We're going to be talking about what the OECD is, what it does, how it relates to other international organizations, and how its analysis of global markets translates into rich data sets, not only for member countries, but for academic and research institutions as well. So before we begin, Will, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about what you do at the OECD?
Sure, thanks. Well, thanks to you, Bill, and to ACRL and Choice for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work of the OECD. We're kind of a well-kept secret, although I think those that do know about us appreciate it. So I'm glad to have the chance to highlight our work a little bit. Our work here in the OECD Washington Center is really quite simple. It's just our job to get Washington and the United States and Canada to love the OECD. But actually, a little bit more seriously, we are an international organization that is funded through your tax dollars. So we want to make sure that the policymakers in Washington and the broader communities throughout the US and Canada understand the bang for their buck that they're getting out of the US and Canada being members of the OECD. So we are here to communicate with, obviously, the US executive branch, the US Congress, but also the broader circles within Washington, D.C. that can affect the making of US policy. And to a similar degree, what goes on up in Canada as well, working with their parliamentarians, with their government, obviously, and then with interested constituencies ranging from the business community to research organizations and universities throughout both countries, to answering media inquiries and working with organized labor and think tanks and the general public. So we're here to serve as a resource to two of our largest and most important member states to make sure that they understand and appreciate and have access to the work of the OECD.
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about what the bang is that they get for their buck. What is
the OECD?
Yeah, what is the OECD and what does it do? What's its mission?
The OECD is an international organization, so you can't join, I can't join, countries join. Right. We have members in the way that the United Nations or NATO would have members. And the OECD has as its mission, at its core, our motto is better policies for better lives. I can go into this a little bit when we talk about why the OECD was created, but essentially it's our job to help the governments of our member states meet the needs of their citizens better, make sure that they develop the policies and implement those policies in ways that eventually improve individuals' lives. So even though we work with the highest levels of governments, the ultimate goal is to make sure that those governments are delivering for their people.
Okay, excellent. So then, what was it? What was the opportunities, I guess, or what was the opportunity the founders recognized in terms of forming the OECD? Why was it?
It's interesting. The OECD was founded in 1961, but actually, the work of the organization kind of predates that. I think most of your viewers, even if they aren't old enough to remember it personally, will remember the Marshall Plan that was instituted by the United States to help reconstruct Europe after World War II. So just like NATO was the security side of the coin to prevent future wars, as the Marshall Plan was being implemented, the countries that were participating in that very important program realized, hey, it's actually useful to get together and kind of compare notes and have a common basis for statistical comparison and to talk about common challenges that we face. So when the Marshall Plan concluded, the founding members of the OECD decided, well, let's keep doing this. So in 1961, I think it was not very many, scarcely more than a dozen or so countries got together to create the OECD. President Kennedy, JFK, signed the membership for the United States, and it was ratified by the U.S. Congress. And lo and behold, the OECD was born. If you look at your calendar, we're rapidly approaching the 60th anniversary of the OECD this year. So we're not young, but we're still spry and I think very responsive and useful in terms of a tool that our countries, our member states turn to help carry out their policies. I think we can get into a little bit more detail about what the OECD looks like because it's a little different from other international organizations, but I'll defer to you.
Yeah. So, obviously countries are members. How do they become a member? Is it
very
they
good
just call
question.
you up and say, I'd like to join your organization?
Oh, sure. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. The OECD differs from some other international organizations like the United Nations, where actually I worked for about 10 years as well. As opposed to the UN, the OECD has global membership because we've grown well beyond just the dozen or so countries that participated in the Marshall Plan that were primarily European and North Atlantic. It now has a global membership of 37 countries, ranging from Japan to Mexico to countries like Korea and Turkey. And Colombia is our most recent member in South America. So while we do have a global membership, at 37 members, we are well below universal membership of the UN, which I think these days has 193 countries. The other aspect is that we are an organization that runs by consensus. So unless you get all 37 OECD member countries to agree to something, the OECD doesn't move forward. That makes it difficult sometimes. It requires a lot of discussion, but you never see voting. And I think that's why many of our members, including the United States, really appreciate OECD membership, is that they're never going to get backed into a corner and outvoted on an issue. It's only going to go forward at the OECD if all 37 of our members come to common ground on it. Like I said, that can be lengthy. That can be sometimes very time-consuming compromise, but the ultimate objective then is something that every one of our members can endorse. That's not to say that the OECD just produces pap that has no real impact. Often our work does, and it leads to conventions or treaties that all of our members agree to ratify and change their domestic laws in order to comply with. So this is a long-winded way of answering your question by saying, hey, I'm Costa Rica. I'd love to become a member of the OECD. In fact, they're in line to become our 38th member. It's a process that takes a number of years because the OECD has, I think, close to 300 working parties and committees and expert groups that get together and work on various aspects of governmental policy. And if you're a country applying for membership, you've got to meet, first of all, our two basic criteria. You have to be a democracy, and you have to have a commitment to a market economy. But then you have to go through all of these hundreds of committees and working groups and expert councils to make sure that your country is living up to all of the OECD standards that we have promulgated over this close to now 60 years of our existence. So that means if you're an OECD member country, you have to ratify the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, and you have to amend your domestic laws to make sure that you're in compliance with that legislation. I love this example because it's a particularly good one for the United States. When I first joined the OECD and the Anti-Bribery Convention was being negotiated, there was a wide variation of government policies regarding bribery of government officials by the private sector. Even to the point where, while it was illegal, obviously, through the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, in a country like Germany, not only was it legal, it was tax deductible as a legitimate business expense. So imagine if you're an American business walking in trying to earn your way in the world, but competing against something like that. It was the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention that leveled the playing field for private sector actors in our member countries, and in a way that really just amplified what was already best practice here in the United States. So if you're looking to become an OECD member country, meeting all of these various standards, obligations, conventions, best practices that the OECD has put forward over its multiple decades existence, That's how you go through the review process of determining whether you're up to snuff, and all 37 members eventually have to give you the green light to
Okay,
join.
I was going to ask.
So we have
Yeah.
a number of countries that, like I mentioned, Costa Rica, that are in the pipeline, and others that are interested in Latin America primarily, where our current Secretary General has done a lot of outreach, and a couple EU countries that are members of the EU but not yet of the OECD that are also interested in joining. So the organization continues to be vibrant and looking to grow.
Okay, excellent. So talk about a little bit more in more detail how you, in other ways, how you interact with members, particularly how you, get from data collection to a policy application. What's happening in between there.
And thanks for asking that. I mean, this is our bread and butter.
Yeah.
I mentioned all of these committees. Who participates in these committees? It's not just someone who comes in off the street. It's generally going to be a government official who is an expert. He or she is an expert in their issue area. So in these 300 plus committees that we have, we get delegates from all of our member states. And we also have permanent missions. So, for example, there is a U.S. ambassador to the OECD, currently vacant, but we're hoping we'll see a name put forward by the Biden administration shortly. So every country has a mission at our headquarters in Paris, but they also send delegates from their capitals to represent themselves on these committees that meet over the course of the year. And these committees will determine the course of work of the organization. The organization is ultimately governed by a council made up of the various ambassadors, and they set and bless the overall program of work every year for the organization. We're about to come up on our annual ministerial meeting that is going to be chaired in our 60th anniversary year by the United States. That'll take place at the end of this month and on June 1st, and then a second part later in the fall, due to the complications that the whole world is experiencing.
Right.
With the coronavirus. So it's these committees that will tell us, well, we want to focus on climate policy, or we want to focus on the response to the coronavirus pandemic, or we want to look at a layer beyond, underneath the pandemic, of how our countries are handling remote education, for example, or retraining workers that have been in industries or sectors that have been intensely impacted by the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. So we will have government delegates that will propose programs of work that will tell us what statistics they'd like us to gather to help support their deliberations, and decide what it is that they want to come out, whether it's an OECD report, whether it's a new OECD program of work to look at a new sector like gender issues or housing policy or educational achievement. And ultimately, they will determine the outcome of the work of us in the OECD Secretariat that support the government delegates that come together.
Okay.
I should also add, I'm sorry, I don't want to forget, because this is an important component of our work. We're not just a hermetically sealed bubble that people can't penetrate. Yeah. We have, as part of our charter, a commitment to work with the business community and with organized labor. So we have standing entities at the OECD headquarters in Paris, the BIAC and TUAC, Business and Industry Advisory Council, and the Trade Union Advisory Council. And they trickle down to affiliates in all 37 of our member states. So in the United States, it's the U.S. Council for International Business that is our partner in making sure that the views of the private sector are adequately considered and taken into account for the policy recommendations that that our member states are considering. And the same with organized labor. It's the AFL-CIO that handles the franchise in terms of speaking for organized labor through the TUAC process at headquarters. So BIAC and TUAC representatives will sit in on just about every OECD committee meeting with the government delegates to make sure that their perspectives are taken into account as well.
Okay, great. Real quick follow-up to that. You mentioned the Biden administration. I'm wondering, if you are able to, mitigate any disruption, if there is any, and, as administrations change, or new leadership is voted in your various member countries.
We are. I mean, we tackle it from a number of perspectives. We have a governance directorate that actually looks at how well our member state countries are running their governments, from the pay of their civil servants to making sure that government procurement is a standard and transparent process, to how transitions work when there's a change in political leadership of our member states, like the one that we are undergoing right now here in the United States. The U.S. is kind of unique in that we have layers of political appointees that go much deeper and broader, in fact, than I'd say just about any other OECD member country. So the transitions here in the U.S. are lengthy, but that doesn't mean that government stops. And in fact, the U.S., whether it's under a Republican or a Democratic administration, understands the value of working with the OECD and has longstanding relationships in just about every cabinet agency and department across the executive branch. So we've got career staff that we've built up relationships with for decades, who are certainly keeping the relationship alive and making sure that the incoming political appointees, as soon as they're confirmed, many of whom are already very familiar with the OECD from their previous experiences, like the Secretary of State Blinken, who knows the OECD very well. These are folks that can come in and work with the career staff to hit the ground running and make sure that they're vigorously participating in the OECD processes. So it's not like things grind to a halt. Sometimes, just as anybody working with a new administration can get a little frustrated that it takes a while before you get all of your assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries and undersecretaries confirmed and in place. Government doesn't stop, and neither does their relationship with the OECD.
Okay, awesome. Wondering if you can get a little more specific about, with some examples of how your work has driven or influenced policy change, maybe.
Absolutely. There are three that kind of come to mind right away. And I did mention the COVID response. I mean, obviously, some of our member state governments had done some preliminary thinking about what a global pandemic would look like and what the burdens would be on governments and citizens and private sector, business, labor in response to that. But once it actually hit, the country scrambled, and the OECD is a perfect place to serve as a resource, because we've got the gold standard when it comes to internationally blessed comparative data. So if you're looking at number of hospital beds, or a number of nurses, or a number per capita spending on healthcare, or length of intellectual property approval processes for new drug treatments. These are things that the OECD has been working on for decades and has lots of really valuable research for our member states to draw upon. And then as countries actually develop their responses, whether it be stimulus spending from our executive branches or approved by the parliaments, we're looking at, like I mentioned, the impact on workers in terms of needing to be retrained, or the impact of schools and childcare suddenly closing and having children at home and having to juggle this new work-life balance that just about everybody has found themselves in, or even just looking at things like connectivity. We're very lucky to be able to have a laptop with a wonderful Wi-Fi network that we can do this virtually. That's not the case for everyone in every country in our member states, including the United States. So how do members of our organization help their governments and their citizens lift themselves up into this new virtual age? That's something that we helped with in terms of COVID response as well. We created just a month or so into the real teeth of the pandemic, a new COVID hub that not only our member states could access, but is available publicly on the OECD.org website. And anybody that's interested in looking at the vast reservoir that is our data in all of these areas is able to go there and find a one-stop shop for COVID response that I think to date has well over 2 million visits. So it's turned out to be an excellent resource since we created it about a year or so ago. That's just one sector. I can bend your ear all afternoon on what the OECD does and doesn't do. I mean, quite simply, we focus on policy areas. We focus on every policy area, put it this way, that our member states focus on. With one exception. If it explodes, we don't get into it. We don't do national security. That's for our friends at NATO and for other sectors or other international organizations. Yep. However, if it isn't involved with security issues, then we're involved in. So everything ranging from education policy to trade to healthcare to migration to environment to development assistance, part of our name. Our member states are among the wealthiest and therefore the assistance, the foreign aid donors of the world. So they come together through our Development Assistance Committee and coordinate effective policies so that we're not out there tripping over each other or working at cross purposes. So the OECD works on policy areas, every aspect of policy that our member governments would.
Yep. I'm curious, are there policy areas that are relatively new that kind of might reflect sort of the direction the world is kind of moving in, or the member countries are?
You set me up beautifully, Bill. Thank you. In fact, I'm glad you reminded me, because a couple of our highest profile areas of work are also amongst our more recent. Obviously, the economy is digitalizing at a dizzying rate, as are our lives. So the OECD has been asked to tackle these areas just like you would expect by our member states. And that entails everything from principles on artificial intelligence, as AI becomes more predominant in just about every feature of our lives. Governments are wanting to make sure that it stays on a course that is beneficial and supportive, and not going to work in cross purposes or potentially even harmful areas. So the OECD put forward principles on artificial intelligence that all of our member states endorsed, and the United States was particularly pleased with about a year or so ago. Perhaps our highest profile area of work at the moment is on digital taxation, or taxing the digital economy, which is actually becoming almost redundant. The entire economy is now becoming digital. But many of our tax codes and founding tax principles were developed 100 years ago, when brick and mortar was all that you had out there to tax. How do you tax, not to single anybody out, but the tech giants? How do you tax a Google or a Facebook or a Twitter? These are things that our member states have been grappling with, and that some of our member states, based on a lot of pressure from their publics, have been addressing in a kind of a haphazard slapdash approach. So that if you are one of these tech giants, you're looking at a global landscape with potentially dozens of different tax regimes that are changing from week to week. Mm-hmm. And it's driving you nuts, because the private sector craves predictability. Yeah. And if they have the rules of the game laid out, then they can adapt accordingly. But if the rules are changing all the time, it's a nightmare. The OECD was a natural place for our member states to come together to try to hash out a common approach to the issue of taxing the digitalization of the economy. But we've had work on combating harmful tax competition and tax practices for decades now through what we call the BEPS process, base erosion and profit shifting. This is making sure that governments can collect the revenue that they are legally owed by their businesses and by their citizens, and that they can do so effectively. And that our member states don't compete one against the other to kind of erode these tax bases. So we had this forum set up, which actually included well over 100 countries beyond just OECD's 37 members, to cooperate on this profit shifting and cracking down on tax havens. So when the debate over the digitalization of the economy really flared up in the last year or so, our member states said, let's get together at the OECD and hash out an agreement. And there's hope, particularly with now the support of the Biden administration coming in, and Treasury Secretary Yellen making a proposal for a global minimum global corporate tax that has found a lot of support amongst our members. There's a lot of optimism that an agreement can be hammered out within the next month or so over the course of this summer. And that business will finally have some of that predictability that they so eagerly crave.
Yeah, excellent. I want to look at what you're doing and how that can be used in areas outside of governmental agencies, particularly through iLibrary. And so how is your output being used, say, in academic and research worlds?
Extensively. And I will begin it with just a little anecdote that really tickled me recently. My son just started med school last year, and we're very proud of him.
Good,
and
great.
As we are of our daughter, who's also working in the international organization field with the United Nations World Food Program. Wow. But our son has been going through remote learning for med school, and I don't think he ever really had any clue what it is that his dad does. But last year, during one of his, not last year, just a week or so ago, in one of his lectures, one of his professors throws up on the screen on his laptop data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And my son suddenly saw that the work of the OECD was relevant to his world, because if you're in the healthcare profession, the OECD just has a treasure trove of data available to healthcare practitioners and the healthcare industry on the bang for the buck that we're getting as American citizens. It's no secret that the OECD data points to the fact that we are spending way more per capita on healthcare than any other OECD member state, but that doesn't always translate into the best results in terms of healthcare. Even something as blunt and broadly measured as life expectancy, we're not seeing the results that we would imagine the amount of resources that we're pouring into healthcare should produce. So these were the things that my son was looking at, and that's an example of how even in the academic world, particularly in the academic world, so much of our research and data is useful to academicians, to librarians and libraries supporting the work of academic institutions, the students doing the research, to other research institutions, whether it be universities and colleges or think tanks or foundations. It's the OECD iLibrary that pulls together the incredibly vast range of our work into a one-stop shopping subscription service that allows the general public or research institutions or academic institutions to get at all of the OECD's work in a user-friendly and one-stop shopping manner.
Excellent. So I'm wondering if there are any challenges to making these resources so widely available.
Very much so. As I mentioned, it's your tax dollars that fund my salary and fund the work of the OECD. But our member states have not given us the resources to promulgate, to disseminate our research and our data and our material, which is why we do have a subscription service for the OECD iLibrary. So it is a challenge to try to get that balance right between what is freely available on the web, and everything that we produce is free to read. But sometimes for the downloading or reproduction or for the maintenance of the platform and the accessibility of maintaining the accessibility of the iLibrary platform, that we finance ourselves through the subscription process. So that's always a challenge. Fairly enough, people will say, well, we're paying for your organization through our tax dollars. Why do we have to pay again to access some of your work? It's because this is an area that our member states have decided we need to self-finance. And it's something that we're continually reviewing and investigating. But this is the model that we're using now, and it turns out to be a relatively popular one as well. I think the statistics that I've got is that we've got well over or roughly 500 institutions in the U.S. that are subscribers to the OECD iLibrary, and a couple thousand plus globally that are subscribers. So it's a package that many research institutions find extremely valuable.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's all we have time for, actually. Thank you very much for joining us on the Authority File, and thanks to our viewers as well. Enjoy the rest of ALA Annual.
Thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate the opportunity.